Okay, hi everyone. So let me go through some of our materials for this week and some notes to get you started. We're in week 10, as you can see, which I can't even believe. So time is really flying by. This week, we'll be going through and working with one more bigger project that has a couple different components until we go through our final culmination period, which we'll talk a little bit more about probably through April when we get through that part. So listen and watch all the notes this week and think of any questions you have, bring them to class with you, and be sure to follow the directions in the discussion board for how you want to respond to your post for this week. This week we're reading an article called Girls, Girls, Girls by Roxane Gay, who is one of my favorite authors, but she really encompasses a lot of what we've been talking about going through the course of last week and this week too. Also, in They Say, I Say, make sure to have read through tying it all together because we're really going to be able to use this book as we go through a lot of our different research components for this week. So I want to give just a little bit of background information. I'm going to flip here to my Word document, just right behind here. I brought this up last week to talk a little bit more about how we're extending our studies of pop culture. I didn't get to talk about all these points, so I wanted to include them today and further talk about them on Wednesday when we get together too. When we're looking at a lot of these varying different articles and looking at a lot of the texts that we've been reading this semester, I want you to make sure you're always thinking about what we're actually referring to when we talk about culture. I'll also post these notes up too, but to think about how you're actually defining culture in general. There's a theorist, his name is Raymond Williams. I want to include him on here. He had three definitions of how he can sort of encapture the idea of culture. He said, first, culture can be the general process of intellectual, spiritual, and aesthetic development. So that makes a lot of sense because we've been looking and talking about a lot of these areas as well. So, for an example, you can think about all the cultural developments of Western Europe, and you can refer to philosophers, artists, poets, other types of writers, even politicians if you want it to in that respect. So, it's combining a lot of these different areas. He also talks about culture as a certain way of life, which makes a lot of sense. It's that part of life, whether of a group of people, a period, a time period, or a group. This is how we have the development of literacy, of holidays, a sport, religious festival, everything that's kind of become a lived culture or a cultural practice, something that now we observe and pass down. And then he said culture can be used to refer to the works and practices of both intellectual and artistic activity. So all the different texts and practices whose function is to signify, whose job it is to say something deeper and to say something more. So things like the art and ballet, soap operas, pop music, music in general, rap music, hip hop, etc. Even classical music, music that doesn't have any lyrics, movies, TVs, anything that goes above and beyond. You can refer to other works, you can look at other practices, but that give you a good place to reflect and think about theory. It is really important because pop culture absolutely links the domains of the public and private. I think that's a huge issue for us today. What is made too much public? What is not made private enough? And of course, for more people than less, it's regardless of age, gender, ethnicity. Popular is defined in a lot of different ways we can see. And I think even more so in 2019, what is popular, or AKA what is trending, what is sort of up for grabs in the news and media today. Of all the different definitions of popular culture, I think these are the ones that if somebody was to ask you on the street, you can kind of pick out and say, all right, well, that means it's well liked by many, or maybe disliked by many, because sometimes what is in the news doesn't always have to be liked. It's anything that's not high culture, meaning that you don't have to so thoroughly study it, be well versed in it. You don't have to have this extreme knowledge in many of these topics. Often at times it's mass commercially produced culture. So we see this where we have repetition of certain themes or certain images over and over again. It's also culture from the people. It sometimes literally becomes very authentic. It becomes what we demand. It becomes what we strive for, what we crave. It's also a struggle between subordinate and dominant groups. So you can say that many times dominant groups in society have a greater say of what goes on in culture, and sometimes dictate certain trends or certain patterns. And of course, popular culture in the context of postmodernism, really this new way of thinking that we moved into post 1950s, 1940s, especially after World War I and World War II. I like to just think of pop culture as culture that's well liked by many. It's the culture which is left over after we've decided what's high culture, what's sort of worthy of us studying and being a little bit more into. Sometimes people think that in order for something to be very culturally worthwhile, that it means it has to be difficult to understand. But that does not mean a lot of the areas that we can study in pop culture need to be difficult. They can be mass produced. They can be part of commercial and culture and be easy enough for us to understand. I like to use this as the example of, well, okay, thinking of those viewpoints, Shakespeare is now seen as the epitome of high culture. But back in his time, his work was a part of popular theater, everyday theater. Now it's part of our sort of everyday culture and curriculum. But of course, when you ask people if they've read Shakespeare or if they studied Shakespeare, it always gives off this very highbrow, high culture way of thinking. So when you're looking at pop culture as part of mass culture, what the masses, what the many people are demanding, it's commercialized, it's produced for mass consumption for great amounts of people. Its audience is a mass of non-discriminating consumers. The culture can become very formulaic. I think manipulative is a really good word to use in terms of both of these definitions. It's a culture which is sometimes consumed with brain numb and brain numbing passivity. We sometimes don't want to think. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I don't know for this part, it can also be associated with important American culture. So one thing as well we want to look at is how it impacts American culture along the way. But I think the important things to remember here, pop culture is the culture which originates from the people. It takes issue that pop culture is imposed on people from above. It literally is of the people and for the people, and sometimes often equated when romanticized with that concept of sort of a very working class culture, which is something that you kind of want to think about. I raised some of these questions last week because I think they're really important. And just to get you looking at them again, because some of these are different areas that you yourself are probably going to want to include in your own research. We asked how we discover ourselves in pop culture. How can we or do we change any negative connotations and definitions, especially with these stereotypes that everybody looked at? Technology, how do these new devices and apps transform the experience, especially in regards to how we perceive and learn different parts of our culture? We talked about how popular music is going to reflect our identities and look at that in varying aspects, as well as television. I have this, sort of grand idea, are we living in a golden age of television? Does the big screen actually shape our dreams and return to movies? Can we get lost and can we be found in different forms of media? And I'm talking about all different types of media, from print to digital to all that is held in both mediums and beyond. And then, of course, what's going to lead us into a lot of issues is our ethics of pop culture and society. And any other issues you kind of want to bring up along the way. I think it's really important to keep these definitions in mind, especially as we're going through and looking at some more readings. So I mentioned looking at Roxane Gay's Girls, Girls, Girls. And I wanted to highlight this article this week, especially because it is a great example of argumentation. It's a great example for they say, I say. But as you're looking at this, if you're not familiar with Roxane Gay, I'll put some more information on her up here. She's a novelist, she's a blogger, she's an editor, she is what I would call a cultural critic. She has had mass amounts of success with many of her books. One of her most recent books is called Hunger, which is a memoir. She has an amazing book called Bad Feminist, another book called Untamed State, and she also was one of the writers for Wakanda. So for the Black Panther series, she co-edits and writes and formerly taught at Purdue University. So I think if you're looking for someone here to reflect on our culture, she has truly immersed herself in writing about our culture for the past at least 10 years. So when you're looking at her piece here, this is an essay from Bad Feminist from her collection, and she's reflecting on the television show Girls. If you've never seen Girls, Lena Dunham was on it, and it was on HBO. It only went off the air about probably like 2 or 3 years ago, not very, very long. In this piece, though, she's looking at the television show Girls, and she's trying to figure out where this idea of girlhood, sort of this intersection of girlhood and pop culture, come together. And she also really wants to talk about the pressures faced by women and people of color when they start to become creators of pop culture. This plays into a lot of the topics you all picked in looking at stereotypes. And I think that's really important to discuss here. I'll pose a couple questions to which you're going to record your own responses this week, but you definitely want to look at her larger view of pop culture, sort of how she incorporates both her own personal experience and observations with using something like a television show, and of course to pull out some examples from here too. Because I think that's really, really important in terms of her writing about pop culture. Even though it's from 2012, I think you can still find a lot of different examples and a lot of different pieces that you can look at. The Rumpus is an awesome sort of cultural critiquing site that you can not only submit your own pieces of writing into on all levels, but ones that have really good commentary too. So I think you'll really enjoy that. So make sure you read carefully. You'll have this week to read through this article. We'll read some other pieces in class, but make sure you pick through it and look for some of the different examples in here. This very much plays into, what you all wanted to look at in terms of talking about some of these stereotypes, television, music, this idea that, probably in the last 50 to 60 years, between music and TV, there's probably been no better mediums that have done so much to shape our American life. Television and music and even movies do this in so many different ways. This goes back from where, first and foremost, the TV was invented, and you get to actually start taking a part in watching the events that happen in history, all the way up to today, where our television programming really looks and summarizes our concerns, our hopes, our enthusiasms. We've really experimented with television, as we've talked about over the years as well. So I think this is a really good place to start here within Girls, 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 showing some of the strengths and weaknesses along with some of the cultural cliches that kind of come with the expectations of this too. So I'm going to flip you back. You can find Girls, Girls, Girls in our modules page, and right underneath that will be our discussion within this for this week. This link will take you directly through there, and then right underneath here I'll link to our discussion tab. So let me know if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, and we'll pick up with some more readings as well. Make sure you pay attention to all the due dates in our discussion forum.